Welcome to our online conference on Levelling Up in the Era of COVID-19. I'm Matt Ross of Global Government Forum. In this session, we're going to be looking at the role and management of infrastructure in promoting economic growth and wellbeing outside London and the South East. In the budget, the Chancellor promised to increase infrastructure spending to 3% of GDP. He allocated, in total, most of $6 billion to metropolitan mayors' transport schemes and higher education and capital spending. He announced a review of the Treasury's Green Book rules, which govern how benefits and costs of infrastructure schemes are assessed. If government sort of maintains its commitment, we'll see more infrastructure spending, but how does COVID affect the kind of infrastructure we'll require for tomorrow's economy? What forms of infrastructure are going to provide the greatest benefits? And how, crucially, should those infrastructure projects be selected, funded, and managed? Who does that? First, we'll hear the perspectives of our four panelists, and then we'll go to questions. If you want to ask a question, you're very welcome. If you go to the Q&A box at the foot of the page, type it in. We will do our best to come to your question, and if you don't answer, we'll answer later by email. So our current panel is Greg McClymont, Assistant Director for Transport and Place at the National Infrastructure Commission; Tim Wood, Northern Powerhouse Rail Director at Transport for the North; Maria Macon-Grosses, the Director of Midlands Connect; and Angela Barnacle, Chief Officer for Asset Management and Regeneration at Leeds City Council. We always say here from the panelists first, and then should say about half an hour for questions. Greg.
Hi, thanks for having me. So I'm at the National Infrastructure Commission. For anyone that's not come across us before, we're independent advisors to government on infrastructure policy, which they then decide whether they're going to accept our advice or not. And the biggest bit of work that we've done to date is a national infrastructure assessment. 2 years ago, we published it. It's a 30-year forward look of infrastructure policy across the sectors we look at. So energy, transport, digital, waste, water and flooding. One of our official objectives is sustainable economic growth across regions. So we've been looking at what is now known as levelling up since before the term levelling up was invented, as one of our kind of things that infrastructure really needs to kind of help address. And I think our starting point with this is to say that infrastructure is really important, but it's actually good to take a step back and remember that infrastructure is probably necessary but not sufficient for places to succeed. And it's important to remember that just because you want a place to succeed, throwing in infrastructure at it might not work on its own. So you do need to take a step back and look at the wider picture. But having said that, there's a session about infrastructure with the Infrastructure Commission. So let's launch into the kind of things that it really can do. I think the thing that we would really be emphasising to government, which fits with our kind of role, is the importance of a longer term strategy. And I think the importance of sticking to the idea of long-term thinking even during a crisis, which obviously is kind of affecting everything right now. But while I think it's important to remember that infrastructure investments last for decades, and what's happening in this crisis won't affect everything forever. And so you do need to while you do need to be aware of how things are changing, and things can sometimes change quicker than you would expect. Also remember that potentially more will stay the same than will change. So keeping an eye on where we need to be in 2050, as well as where we kind of want to try and adapt in the next couple of years, is important, particularly for infrastructure. As it happens, the National Infrastructure Assessment that we published 2 years ago, we think that still represents a good sort of, if you like, ready to go long-term strategy for the government to adopt. And I think that our work really tried to get into some of the long-term trends that are driving infrastructure demand and supply and other requirements over the long term. And a lot of those things are driven by wider social, environmental, economic forces that don't change with periodic crises. Obviously, some things will change. It's probably important to say that it's too early really to tell. So making commitments now to things that will change for the long term based on what's happening right now is probably a bit too quick. Some things that you might look at, I mean, despite this emphasis on long-term strategy, there are some things that probably do work as short-term kind of reactive policies, which do have links to levelling up. So investment in things like full fibre, energy efficient retrofitting, electric vehicles charging. Those are all things that we absolutely need for the long term, but which could also be got going very quickly. And if there are regions which suffer high unemployment as a result of the crisis, and you want to find a way of keeping economies from suffering too much scarring, those are useful things to invest in. But I mean, if you want to really achieve levelling up, the focus really has to be on that longer term strategy. And I think within infrastructure, there's two aspects to it that we would kind of really emphasise and that fit with what we've already recommended to government. The first is the question of kind of revitalising regions and kind of trying to make sure that every region has the opportunity to kind of reach its economic potential. And for us, the focus in that area is particularly on growth in cities, which I'll come on to in a second. And the second is to think about, as well as places that are potential growth hubs for the future, what infrastructure do you need to support local economies and quality of life everywhere? So on the revitalising regions side, I mean, the reason why we really focus on that as an infrastructure priority is that they suffer from a lot of congestion, and that's already holding back growth in cities. So you don't have to kind of you don't have to have too much faith in the power of your policy to see that this is something that could have an impact with investment. There's just not enough capacity, and it just needs to be built to support people to live and work in the places where they're happiest and most productive. And that it sort of sounds like maybe that is like, oh well, maybe that's not very serious about regional supporting all regions, because that might end up focusing on a small number of places. But in actual fact, the cities which are the most congested and are the fastest growing are actually quite well spread out across the country. There are places like Bristol, Manchester, Leeds, which are really obviously kind of fast growing, ready to really expand, and the infrastructure is quite clearly holding them back. So a focus on urban infrastructure, helping people to live and work in cities, is kind of going to continue to be really important. The second kind of aspect that I mentioned is the idea of infrastructure to support kind of all places. So we talk on the transport side. You might not be building a huge metro in every small town and city to try and get the economy going, because it's probably, as I said, that doesn't really meet the it needs to be it's necessary but not sufficient. On the other hand, everywhere needs to have adequate kind of road quality, bus provision, stuff like cycling and walking to help people live good quality lives, access their local high street, local employers. So all of that stuff is really important, and we think the best way to do that is devolve money to local leaders so that they can identify local priorities rather than have central government kind of identify well-meaning but difficult to implement broad kind of themes. Other areas outside transport as well shouldn't be forgotten. So digital connectivity is an area where there's a real risk that some places, particularly rural areas, could get left behind if the market won't provide it. So we think government should invest proactively in full fibre in rural areas to start with. Flood defences is an area that you might not obviously think about as part of levelling up, but actually there are quite wide variations between the level of protection that different settlements of equivalent size have across the country. And so we recommend as government that you should be able to promise everywhere, at least relative to the size of the settlement, a consistent standard of protection from floods. And electric vehicle charging, that's another one where the market won't necessarily provide this in all small rural communities, and in order to have a genuinely national modern green car fleet where everyone can access everywhere that they might want to go, the government needs to invest in that as well. So yeah, I mean that's really in the light of COVID. Some things will change, some things will stay the same. But the message from us to government is focus on the long term and think about regional growth through the perspective of very large scale public transport investment in cities, but also think about the universal infrastructure that needs to be spread across the country on a range of different sectors.
Thank you very much indeed, Greg. Tim, let me hear from you now. Tim, you're on mute.
Apologies for that. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm absolutely thrilled to be speaking to you today. For those that don't know me, I'm Tim Wood, Northern Powerhouse Rail Director at Transport for the North. Before I start, I'd like to say a thank you to the webinar's organisers, Global Government Forum, for the invitation to speak to you all today. It's fair to say we're living through an extraordinary set of circumstances. Events such as these are playing sort of a role in rethinking how transport potentially could go forward and major infrastructure programs. Rail industry's future looks set to be a very interesting one. Several major schemes continue to move forward on their respective journeys to transform the UK's rail economy. If we cast our minds back earlier this year, feels like a lifetime ago, doesn't it? March's budget announcement, coupled with publication of the Oakley Review and the subsequent ongoing assessment of rail investment in the North and the Midlands, indicated that the government saw substantial investment in Northern Rail network as an essential part of levelling up the agenda. Fast forward a few months and the world is quite literally amid a pandemic. I'm sure we're all aware of the economic downturn the pandemic has actually had on the country's economy, and the government is now looking to identify ways of kickstarting it post-COVID-19. Over the past few months and weeks, I've heard people question the role of rail in a post-COVID world. What I'd like to say to those people is, firstly, look at the constriction of the economy, a 20% downturn in recent figures. And secondly, it's important to remember that the long-term trend has been one of huge growth on our railways, some 194% increase in patronage in the last 20 years. The current snapshot should not deflect from building the much-needed capacity that is required across the North's rail network. For decades, poor infrastructure has suppressed the North's potential and constrained its growth. I'd argue that with an added emphasis on a green economic recovery from the government, there is a heightened focus on how rail infrastructure investment might be delivered sooner to stimulate the required boost in the economy. Could you just change the slide for me, please? Northern Powerhouse Rail at its core is designed to unlock the economic potential of the North by transforming its rail connectivity across the regions and towns and cities that we have. There's a series of interventions. MPR will significantly improve the capacity and journey times across the North Rail network. Take the Leeds to Manchester corridor, for example, with an MPR journey time of just 25 minutes. That's 21 minutes quicker than the current fastest journey time. The agglomeration between Leeds and Manchester currently stands at around 40%. MPR starts to bring those city regions far closer together. And added to that, there'll be an extra 2 fast services as well between Leeds and Manchester via a new line via Bradford. That enhanced connectivity across the North, coupled with an extra 35,000 seats every hour between the key cities at peak times, enables the North to operate as one single economy. And let's not forget, we'll also be taking 64,000 cars off the road every day. Could you change the slide, please? That results in a multi-billion-pound increase in the GVA per year, creating thousands of better quality jobs in our towns and cities and driving that regeneration. By better connecting our region's strongly performing sectors, we can rebalance the economy and bring forward tangible benefits to Northerners that will make a real difference in their lives. The increase of productivity up to 2% in better connected places will go some way to closing the North-South economic divide. Could you please change the slide again? A central aspect of ensuring the North's economic potential is realised to ensure that major rail infrastructure projects such as HS2 Phase 2B and Network Rail's Trans-Pennine Route upgrade align with Northern Powerhouse Rail. And that's part of the IRP that's going on currently at the moment. As I'm sure you're aware, the Integrated Rail Plan exploring how major rail programmes actually physically will dovetail together. These projects need to become greater than the sum of their parts and progressed at pace for the North's businesses and passengers. Delivery of NPR, HS2 and Trans-Pennine upgrade in full is an absolute necessity to levelling up the national economy. Transport for the North issued its submission to the National Infrastructure Commission's call for evidence on the 29th of May this year. The message from the North is really clear. There needs to be a straightforward and coordinated investment plan in our rail network, committed funding and a role for the North in deciding and delivering these schemes. The Integrated Rail Plan is a clear opportunity to coordinate all major rail interventions in a coherent, phased 20-year pipeline of investment, avoiding further delay and uncertainty. It must be aimed at delivering the long overdue economic, social and economic benefits for the North and provide the same high-speed railway that runs between London and the Midlands. It is critical that Transport for North retains a strong voice and central role in deciding how this work is brought forward and delivered. Transport for North represents the North. We must be heard loud and clear when developing and deciding these plans. The North just cannot wait any longer before these issues are addressed. You just change the slide, please. So I think we've made it really clear where we're going. It's that absolute investment, that straitjacket that we've been in for the last 4 decades. It's the only way that we're going to open up and really grow the economy in the north of England and actually level up, as the PM wanted, the north-south divide. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Tim. For another regional perspective on transport, Maria.
Hello, thank you, Matt, and welcome everybody. I'm delighted to be here with all of you. I haven't got any slides, so for those who are not familiar with Midlands Connect, very brief introduction. Midlands Connect is the subnational transport body for the Midlands, and for just testing some geography, it covers the Midlands region from the Marches in the Welsh borders between Shropshire, Herefordshire and Worcestershire, all the way towards the east at the Lincolnshire, and we are delighted, almost 11 million people, and coming together as a subnational transport body for one reason and one reason only, because the Midlands understood the importance for making sure that national infrastructure served the needs of the Midlands, and rather than all of us having a single view of what a railway or motorway or access to our airports, energy, you know, things like that, rather than us having 200 whispers giving views and ideas, we came together to make sure that when government took decisions, future decisions on national investment, the needs of the Midlands were there and were well understood. So we come together, we bring together leaders from all across the Midlands, we bring together labs, organizations from business industry, we bring together our airports, and during the last 5 years, we have developed a strategy, a transport strategy for the Midlands, and perhaps one of the most recent examples of our work has been around the development of Midlands Engine Rail, one of our proud moments when we set out to government as part of the HS2 agenda that HS2 was not to be considered in isolation. It needed to be looked at in an integrated way with a conventional network. We were desperate for better east-west connectivity in the Midlands, but we were also very keen to explore opportunities for freight, for passenger, better, more increased commuter services locally. We wanted to look at how we could decarbonize our railways faster. So all of that came together under the MER, the Midlands Engine Rail. And now we're feeding, similar to our colleagues in the North, we're feeding into the integrated rail plan the government is developing for the national railway, and hopefully that will feed also into the national strategy, transport strategy that was referred earlier by NIC colleagues. So why do we feel Midlands Connect is so important at the moment, and how it links with the levelling up agenda? You know, we thought Midlands Connect was the first investment from government in levelling up. we have to acknowledge that. It was great that there was an appetite to work with the Midlands region as one in consensus, and they empower us to identify what priorities we wanted. We've done that well. We have, like the North colleagues, set those out clearly, and we have presented those to government. Government actually has also invested in us in terms of allowing us to progress with the pipeline or those 7 schemes, those 7 projects that we got in the Midlands and Rail. We're accelerating the development. So they're not just a vision or a grand idea, they do come into fruition. And I guess the challenge now is to make sure that those schemes do get delivered on the ground. So, when you got the consensus of people, leaders, political leaders of all parties, in terms of what needs to happen when in the Midlands, government hopefully will need to listen, and we do feel very strongly about it. In that making of that national infrastructure that has to have a national role and a national purpose, we need to make sure that the needs of the Midlands are there and well considered. So let's not look at transport in isolation. One of the added values that we bring, and this is part of the wider levelling up agenda, is that transport, as you know, cannot be seen as a transport sector in isolation. It does enable a lot of economic but also social agenda, and as part of that we also need to think of transport as an enabler of new technology and innovation. So a lot of times people think of us as people who are just focusing on railways, we're just focusing on concrete and tracks. Absolutely not. One of the challenges for all of us in the transport industry is how we broaden our activity, how we actually integrate, as Greg mentioned earlier, with the wider low carbon agenda, particularly now more than ever, because this crisis no doubt has represented a huge challenge for us in terms of what transport might look like in the future. As you said, Matt, earlier at the beginning, how you prioritize what type of investment you want to bring in. And the best way to do this is to actually integrate far more the work between the transport sector and other sectors like energy, digital, and so on. So again, we don't create silos in innovation. Transport sector was going to require a huge amount of thinking and innovation around digital infrastructure, in terms, and also charging infrastructure, for instance, for autonomous vehicles, but also how we communicate to people the decisions that they're going to make. How do we make them well informed so they can take the right decisions, whether they want to go on the railways, whether they want to go walking, cycling, or on the roads. And this phenomenon that we're experiencing at the moment, it has shown us something, that the options need to be there and they need to be as sustainable, as green as possible, so those decisions are informed well. And I'll finish by then, Matt, I think the purpose of today's discussion is, why do regions are so important all of a sudden? How government is listening to regions, and we feel regions as a whole are going to be extremely important in the future, because no longer the decisions on investment on major transport infrastructure can be taken centrally. It's really, really important that the regions feel part of the debate, and they feel like they have been part of that advising, that sort of intelligence that no doubt government is going to need more than ever to inform and to make those very hard decisions in the future.
Yeah, thank you. We'll come back to these topics in the questions, I think. Yes, finally, Angela, if we could hear from yourself, both from Leeds and, of course, you're embedded in the new West Yorkshire Combined Authority as well, which has got infrastructure responsibilities.
Thank you, Matt, and hello, everyone. So I am Angela Barnacle. I'm the Chief Officer for Asset Management and Regeneration at Leeds City Council. I'm a commercial practice surveyor by trade, so I know quite a bit about CPO and quite a lot about delivery and a lot about L&T and high streets and business rates and stuff like that. But when I took this role 3 years ago, I had to get to know quite a lot about the rail industry and wider infrastructure. But actually the critical bit was, as Maria said, matching that national impetus with local need and local delivery, and how you glue the two together. And I'm not going to repeat anything of my colleagues, because I largely agree with everything that they've said. So I'm going to try and add to the conversation through why is local so important, and local authorities, and touch on that COVID response. I think if I look back to that week in March where we had devolution announced, you know, long term on the table for West Yorkshire. We'd positioned some of our infrastructure projects extremely well, things like British Library North. So Leeds is home to the British Library. 70% of the collection is about 3 miles behind this door here. But their presence is not felt within their north. And in terms of infrastructure, that access to knowledge and the access to entrepreneurship was really vital for the city. And when you blend that with national connectivity too, you start to really get that power in that powerhouse in the north. And then not 3 or 4 days later, we were responding to a pandemic where our quality team, who was delivering the congestion charging facility, got pivoted to responding to opening up a warehouse to distribute food parcels. And I think that's what you have in a local setting. You have that agility and local knowledge of what's needed at that time. And we stepped back about 3 or 4 weeks ago from responding to think about, well, this is business as usual, what does recovery look like and what does infrastructure play in that? And we stepped back and looked at our policies. The one policy in Leeds that we all stand behind now is our inclusive growth policy, which is very straightforward. It's about people, place and productivity. And if I delve into that place element, it's about the federal economy, so giving people things that they need in their location. It's about giving 21st century infrastructure. It was about doubling the size of our city centre, but that wasn't just about physically doubling, it was about doubling the productivity and making sure that the city centre had that infrastructure. And that policy is mirrored with our health and wellbeing strategy and our climate emergency policies. And we stepped back and we thought, we actually have the right plans. We had them pre-COVID, but COVID has really changed how we will implement and how we have to accelerate some things and how we have to write a new implementation plan for other things. And the things that I think we probably have not touched on in this debate is about that digital connectivity. So in Leeds, we've used our own buying powers to get a backbone, a spine of broadband connectivity. So using it into our own council housing and our own services so that other people can connect into that at a much cheaper rate. And I mean, Tim and I, and we've worked very closely with Maria's team on things like HS2 East and integrated rail. But there's actually that local connectivity, that walking strategy, that cycling strategy, which is what we're accelerating right now. And in Leeds, what we've tried to do is respond to that massive growth curve in people who wanted to walk and cycling by putting in things that were stepping stones towards where we eventually wanted to go. So I've learned a lot about orcas and wands in the last 6 weeks, and it's not something from Harry Potter, it's how you segregate cycle lanes. And it's that type of infrastructure response that I think we need both nationally and locally, that ability to go from, I spend a lot of my time working on HS2 East, that big long-term infrastructure of 20 years, but actually what do we need in the next 20 days? And I think that's where local place can really connect into that. And the final point I would like to make, which I think Greg touched on, is I hear a lot of conversations with many civil servants about, do we now need to alter the growth forecasts for passenger transport? And if there's one thing I will really die in a ditch on, it will be, please don't change those growth forecasts. At the minute, we really need to nudge behaviour. I talk to my children like, we've now got to believe in the future we want to see. And if we really want to move towards a low carbon agenda, etc., we need to get people out of their cars, and autonomous vehicles are not the answer. You know, we know in the north congestion costs us £7 billion a year, and now we've got that added complexity, that wicked question now where people are going to be less reliant on real estate. We now know that everybody can work agilely. We can't imagine the reach that this webinar is having, and we didn't all have to come to London to do that. So I can really feel that pressure that civil servants will be under to change growth forecasts and to think that we perhaps don't need that long-term ability. And I don't say this lightly because my husband has a postgraduate degree in public health and works for the NHS, is we will have short memories. Our young people will still want to travel. They will still want to be connected. They still need to travel places. And whilst this will have certainly a short-term impact over the next probably 3 to 5 years, in the next 15 to 20, our future will probably largely still play out in the way that we make happen now. So I think committing to that green carbon agenda, committing to local insights is something that I'd really make a plea for. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's really interesting. We have got a whole number of questions come in. I will definitely come to them in a sec. Just on firstly, I mean, a couple of you have kind of given your sort of views on this already, but yeah, at the moment everybody is thinking, what does COVID mean for the economy, for the future of kind of the way the economy grows, and thus the infrastructure we need? Can I just very briefly ask each of you, do you think we sort of basically pause work on the national infrastructure strategy and have a good think and try to look forward, or actually are the fundamentals right and we can't waste any more time? I'll go to people in the order in which they've contributed so far. So Greg, are you able to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it is difficult because, as I said, we don't know behaviour change. There's bound to be some as a result of COVID. We don't know what it will be and how much there is, and so there's a temptation to say wait and see. On the other hand, I think there are some things which we undoubtedly need, and which there's in some cases very little, or in some cases low prospect of change. I mean, I would say almost 50% of your infrastructure strategy should be focused on tackling climate change and kind of other environmental problems like flood defences. And there's zero prospect of COVID having any effect on those. So, I mean, there's no case for pausing on stuff like that at all. And on the transport side, urban transport, it takes a long time to build these things and to kind of gather momentum behind them. And obviously there is some risk that if you start working on that now, that you pick the wrong things. But I think the point isn't if we start working on strategies for massive enhancement of public transport in cities, which is what we've said we think we need, they're not going to be even start building them within 5 years' time, by which time we'll know kind of a bit more about how we might want to adjust the plans. And it's pretty unlikely that they'll turn out to be totally unnecessary, even if you need to adapt them somewhat. So we would say to government, do get on and do a national infrastructure strategy. Make it sensitive to the fact that you might need to adjust it as things go on, but don't sit around and wait, would be our advice, I think.
I think each of the rest of you all kind of said, let's not go back to square one on this. Is it unless you want to make any further comment on this question?
I think it's just what's really important to say is, Greg's absolutely right. There are going to be some sensitivities around this, but within the north of England, we're absolutely in a straitjacket. Capacity and connectivity is really constraining that economic growth. 15 million northerners versus sort of 8 million in the southeast, and yet the GVA that we produce is half that of the southeast. And there is no way without these transport interventions and work, things like Northern Powerhouse Rail, things like High Speed 2 Phase 2B coming up, are we going to have a chance to actually start to really have a blossoming economy up in the north of England? We will just continue to be constrained. So I think it's really important that, back to Greg again, these are long-term schemes that until they're started, you just keep going out further and further and further. And in the north of England, if you've ever got on a train between Manchester and Leeds pre-COVID, you would have probably stood all the way. If you go between Bradford and Leeds today, it's 8 miles. It takes 26 minutes on a train. Can somebody tell me if that's right in the 21st century? I think not.
And Matt, if I may add to that, I think from another angle, which is really important, the voice of businesses and communities are saying, please don't stop doing this, stop, diddle and delay. We have suffered from this for ages, and that's why, again, the regions have decided to come together, because there was always an excuse. It was either politics, or it was either, something will come up during the year. And COVID is a massive, obviously unprecedented. We never experienced anything like it, but there's more need. I think there's even more reason for why people say, look, there was this pipeline that was felt really important. Don't just start reviewing it again. Let's make sure, and we all feel strong actually that most of the pipeline that we put forward to government meeting the sustainability and climate change agenda, because we do want more people into public transport in particular. So this stop, dither and delay has to stop, and a lot of the businesses and the cities and towns across the Midlands want certainty more than ever. So we keep saying that integrated rail plan has to be a plan. It cannot be yet another vision. That national infrastructure strategy has to be a strategy that has got attached a plan of execution. And we're talking that language now. We need to be really firm, very clear, and in prioritizing, sequencing, and a plan that then our businesses and our cities can get back behind, knowing that they can plan for the skills required, they can plan for how they're going to bid for those contracts. This is what we need now. We don't want another 10-year planning. We need to accelerate, if anything, accelerate a program of investment.
Yes, the world keeps on changing ever faster, doesn't it? So we wait for it to stop changing, then. Yeah, wow, sorry, Angela.
We costed the delay every year that HS2 is delayed. It cost the Leeds City region alone economy £1.7 billion.
Yeah.
So delay is what the most painful type of no is a very slow no.
Yeah.
Angela, you sparked that question away by your comment. So I'll come to you first on this next one. It's Alison Ring. There's a couple of questions. One of which is, what would have to be included in the Green Book to actively promote sustainable local investment to provide real levelling up results? So that, I mean, it's about, what should this review of the Green Book do? I'd actually broaden it a bit to the decision-making process. Maria talked very much about the need to sort of consult with reasons. Well, how should the actual process be changed? It is very, very top down right now. We need a strategy, but where should decision-making powers lie? And again, on the Green Book, how should the emphasis of sort of cost-benefit be shifted? Angela?
Well, I think sometimes it's the parameters that we choose to measure. So, for instance, we've been working on a flood scheme where the immediate impacts produce a PCR of 1.1. But actually, if we take in the wider impact of the agglomeration, the BCR is 5.7, which is, it's a no-brainer to do things like that. So I think sometimes it's about the parameters that we choose to draw, and that's within our gift to redraw. And I would say embedding, I think you've had an earlier panel on where should the civil service be located. But if the civil service is located in the places where we are writing these BCRs, you don't then get lost in the nuances of equations, etc. So I would say the team has to be, it's not a case of we submit it and then we wait. It's about we have to be together on that journey and make sure that metrics we're choosing to measure are delivering the outcomes we're trying to achieve. And I say that very lightly, and I know it's going to be really hard work to redraw that.
Maria, do you want to come back in on this one?
Yes, well, I completely agree with Angela. And the point about the parameters are really important. I started by saying we in the Midlands understand fully that when you talk about national infrastructure, the national infrastructure has to have a national role, right? This is not about dividing and chopping our national rail network or our national strategic rail network. That is definitely not what we want here. But what we want is that national infrastructure to serve the needs. So when it comes to Green Book, one of the things that picked up very quickly, and again with HS2 we have had a similar issue, it's the benefits analysis. The BCRs of the Green Book is just focused on very much on numbers, on crunching, how, demand, and based on as Angela was saying, figures that is targeting hotspots of the network for tackling that particular congestion issue, and those that are in the crisis period, those are the ones that do best in BCR. What it doesn't do is acknowledges the wider economic and social benefits, and that's what it links to the levelling up agenda. So the point about how the decision making around how investment is taken not just purely on transport basis, but it brings in the wider agenda. That's very difficult to be done centrally. You need to understand what's going on at a more grounded level to make those informed decisions. So I'm absolutely with you. The Green Book does need revisiting, and it's not going to be easy, but we're going to have to bring in much wider factors, including climate change.
Thank you. Tim?
Yeah, so for us, if we went down the road of relying on BCRs for MPR, we would struggle. It's more around the strategic case. So what we've had to do is develop, in conjunction with the department, our own software, so NELM and norms. And what that allows us to do is to take the level 2 benefits and really start to build in things like land value capture, that whole holistic view that, of course, will move the BCRs up to a more positive position. But if we just use Planet only looks north-south, and actually NPR is an east-west railway. So, you have to be really innovative in bringing these things forward and spending the money to actually make sure that you can really articulate those key messages of why should we go ahead with this. But we're starting off at a really low base. So again, that economic benefit, that economic output, why are you trying to bring the sort of key economic centres and city regions together? It's like the rural Rhine effect. Bringing them together ups the actual ability for economic growth, because they're closer together. They can move quickly in between. So jobs and people moving around happens a lot quicker than today.
Thanks. And Greg?
So yeah, I think the Green Book review will be very interesting, and I think for us though, maybe the point is to kind of see cost-benefit analysis in its context as what the tool is kind of for, but it's not necessarily the question of strategic decisions about where you should put your investment nationally and how to prioritise should probably be made on the basis of kind of strategic considerations and strategic evidence. So to give, I guess, a bit of an example, the work that we did on identifying investment needs for urban transport, that's not based on kind of looking in too much detail into the weeds of cost benefit analysis, different kind of weightings for different places. You can actually analyze these things on a much more simple basis by saying, like, here are some places where quite clearly the infrastructure is constrained and where growth could occur and is being limited, and actually political judgment does come into that a bit as well, because you might feel that it's the kind of country that people want to live in, which is not necessarily always addable up. And so, there should be a place for strategic analysis based on evidence. People shouldn't be free to just kind of make stuff up that they like, but that doesn't necessarily need to all filter down into this one tool, to decide kind of what kind of priorities you want to have, what your objectives are, and then you would be using cost benefit analysis to say, okay, we've set this objective for ourselves, what's the most cost effective way of doing it, which is what cost benefit analysis is good for. So just making sure that the wider range of tools is used alongside the Green Book, I think would be our emphasis.
Thank you. There's another question around, it returns a bit to the previous question, but it's kind of, we're going into a depression or recession of some major kind. We'll come out, there will be, growth sectors around the world we want to tap into. To some extent, maybe the direct return you get on an investment right now in a kind of an emerging market might be less in the short term than an investment, a continued investment in existing infrastructure. But it might produce longer, greater benefits over the long term. So are there particular forms of infrastructure we should prioritise to help deprived areas, post-industrial areas, reshape their economies around emerging industries? There's obviously the kind of green renewable sector, there's education, there's digital. I know we've got a lot of transport people here, but I'll start with Greg, actually. Any thoughts on that one?
I mean, the overarching point that I would make on that is that these kind of questions are best answered at the local level. And I think the point that Angela made, we've done some work with West Yorkshire on some of the plans that they're doing, and the kind of stuff about inclusive growth that they're doing there is really amazing and impressive, and just simply couldn't have been done in Whitehall. Couldn't even have been done by the National Infrastructure Commission, because it's just, there's so much kind of about bringing together different sectors. There's not just transport, it is all of these other policies, and local authorities, unlike Whitehall, do actually manage all of these policies together with a focus on one particular place, and have the ability to then prioritise between policy areas, rather than saying like, okay, the current administration thinks buses are a good thing, so we're going to have like a little bit more bus everywhere. It just isn't helpful. So there are lots of things that I think that local authorities can do to promote inclusive growth, but the thing to emphasise is it's not the same everywhere. And so kind of, just devolving money and having confidence in accountable local leaders to get that right is what I would emphasise.
Thank you. And yeah, I mean, a number of you actually have talked about the importance of integrating transport with other sectors. I wonder, I mean, both Tim and Maria work for, transport organisations with a very large footprint. Angela for, obviously, a city council that does everything within a relatively small footprint. I'm curious about, I know we've got the next session is on combined authorities, really, but just quickly, your views on what is the role of combined authorities? Is that a sensible level to make those strategic decisions, but also to connect up different issues across the sort of city region? Tim?
Yeah, a really good question, Matt. I mean, for me, transport is purely the enabler to get a far bigger bang for your buck in terms of economic growth. And what's been really important that I've seen, Transport for North, our 20 board members are metro mayors and key city region leaders, and their input and their working teams below that have been absolutely instrumental in helping us develop the strategic outline case, which will be delivered back to that board in March next year on MPR. And that local knowledge, talking about what developments they're looking at doing, can really tie in with the railway network. I know there was a question that came up from Rachel there about MPR. So MPR does actually affect the whole of the northern network. It's existing train services tying into our key stations and hubs, and people will get a quicker service. So I live in Lancaster. If I want to go from Lancaster to Leeds, I'll take at least 2.25 hours today. But with MPR, I will get on a normal train down to Manchester and then get on an MPR service, and I'll be there in around about an hour and a half. So I already have a journey time saving and a real benefit. I just think the other bit of building on that is the active travel piece. So it's either that last mile going into the station or out from the station. Industry's booming at the moment. Well, clearly the bike industry is booming at the moment because everybody's out on their bikes. But I think that the big concern is, just reading in the news now, out of the 8 million people that are furloughed at the moment, 25% of them may find that when they come back, they just haven't got a job. And I think that is a real immediate concern in terms of still being able to put people to work, because people working pay taxes, and taxes will help fund a number of these programs of work. So all that thinking around what it looks like in terms of getting people to other opportunities and jobs across the North and the Midlands as well is absolutely vital.
Thanks. Maria, yes, this point on the role of city regions. Also, actually, we're going to address Rachel McQueen's question, where she's concerned that some of these projects miss out the opportunities within counties such as Lancashire and Cumbria. We only level up our cities, we lose phase of the population behind.
So I in the Midlands we only got one combined authority, and it's a brilliant combined authority. I mean, it's driving huge innovation when it comes to very light rail, bus rapid transit, 5G test beds, autonomous vehicles, digital. We got a very innovative combined authority that, luckily for us, also acknowledged the importance that they cannot just connect to the world in isolation. We also got the rest of the Midlands who acknowledges the importance of a big core centres like Birmingham, Nottingham, Derby. But this is not just about cities, as you know. We do have the Marches, Herefordshire, the Shires, who are extremely actually important when it comes to economic activity in terms of agri-food, agri-tech, manufacturing. So the needs are very diverse. So your point, the combined authorities are very good because they acknowledge the proximity of the strategic centres and how they can collaborate. But then you've got to expand it out a bit, and that's why they're so supportive of Midlands Connect, because you need to acknowledge that you need to relate to the surrounding, neighbouring economic activity. So it cannot be just about core cities and urbans, as absolutely important as they are. We need to acknowledge that correlationship between us, and there is an area of opportunity for those big footprint bodies like Midlands Connect and Transport for the North when it comes to a scalability of new technology. So we're learning from the combined authority what they're doing on 5G and autonomous vehicles. We want to roll it out at a wider scale. The people out there do not acknowledge boundaries, and they don't want to go to one part of the Midlands and then the moment they go somewhere else, the standards fell dramatically. And also that will support, I think there was a question about young people. The scalability of innovation and technology might help a lot of the young people know where the direction of travel is, and therefore we can target a bit more a skills program towards that. And that's going to be extremely important for the young population of the Midlands.
Thank you. Angela, the role of combined authorities and how to get not to leave the other bits behind.
Well, it's interesting your comment that said obviously that I work on a local level. I mean, Leeds is the second largest authority after Birmingham, but I don't just work in Leeds. I helped author the HS2 Leeds City Region Growth Strategy. We always work on that larger geography and right down. So we do cooperate extensively because it's the only way that we can perform. And Maria's absolutely right. We don't just think to boundaries. We think about how do we connect, how do we innovate, which is why obviously Tim and I will meet monthly. We work Maria's team on HS2 East, etc. But Maria made a good point about our young people and innovation, and I think getting back to Rachel's question about leaving out our towns. If I come back to HS2, there's a big fear that HS2 will do nothing for Wakefield or for Huddersfield or for part of the towns that it doesn't go through. But fundamentally, what it does, it provides that capacity on the network to make sure that our local services can actually operate and they can stop at stations and pick up. So it's about a capacity issue. But beyond that, and picking up Maria's point about skills, we spent a long time working with the Rail College at Doncaster. Leeds has got the only dedicated building college in the city, within the country. We worked with Leeds University about how do we build that pathway linked to HS2 so that our children come in, what was into year 7 2 years ago, can see a future that is about advanced manufacturing, but using rail as the hub to do that. So at the minute, Leeds are on site, Leeds University are on site in the enterprise zone, which in theory will be co-located with the HS2 depot, building a high-speed operating and systems integration institute. And this will be a global first where they will not just test the catenary and the track on what I can only describe as a surveyor as like a huge treadmill, but they will test the interoperability of the M&E equipment and the systems. So if you care to remember when the Azumas were tested on the network, they had to be tested on the live rail network. And then when they got stuck, because they realised actually the signalling didn't talk to the train set, everybody else was stuck behind it. Whereas actually what this facility will allow us to do is to test it in real time with real modelled conditions to make sure that doesn't happen. And then when you're creating that pathway from from level 3 apprenticeship right through to level 7 coming out at University of Leeds, you're actually creating a future for our young people based on a long-term infrastructure plan. And surely that is what it's about.
Thank you. Just, we've got 5 minutes. Let's hear a question from Lawrence Quinn. He likes this session, real practicing folk delivering rather than debating, tightly argued positions rather than the earlier policy wonks of our previous sessions. People who do stuff. Can the panel comment on what they hope for from the Chancellor's anticipated July financial statement? I won't guide you any further by reading again what he suggested. What would you like to see coming out of this next financial statement? Can I go from Angela up again? Regent. I'm sorry, you're on mute, Angela.
I did promise myself I wouldn't do that today. I really would like to see an end to this debate about will we or will we not do an integrated rail. I'd just like us to say, yes, we're doing it. We're now just working out how we're going to do it. So this continuous delay is causing us a huge problem. And I'd also really like to see a further commitment to more devolved integration.
Devolved integration?
As in, if we're going to give funds out, let's make sure that they are delivered at a local level. So how do you, in terms of that delivery, could the civil service embed themselves locally into a local team rather than having a national team delivered out of Whitehall that then locally feed in? So that kind of, that transfer of that cycle, certainly in terms of that fiscal commitment, an end to this ongoing saga about rail.
Yeah, the sort of the commitment to have 750 strong sort of economic policy making campus with business department, treasury, I can't remember who else was in there. You'd have to think that the lived experience of the people then living in an area and experiencing transport in the north on a day-to-day basis would lead to a different set of decisions being made.
And not only that, I mean, I've had a really unfortunate incident where when we were talking about the retrofitting of our housing stock, and this isn't just in Leeds, I had to explain to people what a back-to-back house was. And, you know, but that's because people haven't lived in those areas where they've come across those things, and they're things locally that we take for granted that on a national level people understand.
Yeah.
Matt, if I may, I mean, I know that this particular fiscal announcement is going to be very much on the recovery angle. So I know that there's a huge amount of a need for local investment at the moment. So Midlands Connect has made it very clear in our conversations with government. With us, the only thing we want is that clarity, as you say, that certainty that the integrated rail plan will be a plan, and that continue investment in the development of our pipeline is going to be very, very important. So we don't want at the moment capital, we want development because our program needs accelerating so they can be implemented. At the moment, we need to be really realistic about the pressures that at the moment our local authorities, our combined authorities are experiencing. So investing in placemaking, I heard comments in the audience around what happens to the high streets, what happens to our city centres. This is going to be hugely important. So investment in placemaking and digital, and that's going to be very important for the next 6 months, I would say, personally.
Thank you. Tim, so we're down to a minute or two, if you could.
Yeah, just very quickly, just some key messages. So Northern Powerhouse Rail is funded till the end of the financial year. We've got enough money to complete strategic outline case. I think for us, you know, what's really important, and one of the questions asked before, I'm a contractor by background, so I design and build railways, and coming into this role has been quite an eye-opener with the amount of sort of policymakers, the amount of chess pieces getting moved around the same board. So our intention is to really get into the numbers and really understand how costs can be driven far harder, rather than actually, you know, we end up with, here's what the cost's going to be, just get on with it, and then all of a sudden we find 3 or 4 years later it's doubling or trebling. Where's all the control measures? So actually, if you put the control measures in early and you have a bona fide scope of works, then what you'll be able to do is stick to that. And what we don't do in this country, and why we're really on a naughty step with rail, is we keep blowing the budgets. And that absolutely has to stop, because that extra investment can go into programs that, as Maria just said there, placemaking, vital flood defence, alleviation projects. What that will do is give people work. You know, people, I don't think have got to grips with that. It's a massive ill wind coming in this country. and we need to be right front and centre in making the right kind of decisions first time. We can't keep kicking the can down the road on these things, because there's going to be millions of people affected. And I think that's really important that we get that key message across, that now's the time to stand up and be counted. Let's get this right. Where are the answers? Not necessarily all within the policymakers, a lot within the actual construction and design industry that are able to bring their innovations to the fore that have currently actually been really suppressed over the years.
Thank you, Tim. Very well expressed. I can sense a whole set of feature concluding words in those pithy comments there. Greg, I'm sorry we're a minute over, but if you could just have 20 seconds on what do you think you should do with this fiscal event?
Well, we want to see a long-term vision for a national infrastructure strategy, but my top priority is kind of really big transport projects for cities outside London that need them the most. Not just incremental improvements over the next 5 years, but stuff that between now and 2040 would kind of change the face of the places that need it the most, the handful of cities that are growing the fastest and have the most congestion.
Thank you all very much indeed to the panel, to our knowledge partner, Centre for Public Impact, to everybody viewing. Apologies if you heard my neighbour Azad sneezing there a lot. He has hay fever. We'll be publishing reports to these sessions. You'll get emails with them and a link to the webinar. We will be back in a mere 13 minutes for the final panel discussion on the role of combined authorities in pursuing levelling up. But meanwhile, thank you all very much indeed. Cheers.